In my talk, I will discuss the consequences of Islamization for women and girls, and I somehow repeat something what Professor Afshar already said, because I want to start with the Iranian example, the murder of the young Kurdish woman Gina Mahsa Amini, who had been arrested in September 2022 by the Islamic Morality Police in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and was subsequently murdered in prison. Her offense was the non-observance of Islamic clothing rules, and her death triggered a nationwide wave of protests that could only be suppressed by extreme brutality of the regime. And surprisingly, I want to mention this too, our former foreign minister Annalena Baerbock said, this has nothing to do with Islam. And with this example, you can see the core of the problem I'm going to talk about. On the one hand, you have the violent elimination of women's rights in the name of Islam, and on the other hand, the denial of this religiously legitimized violence by opinion-forming multipliers in the West. It is not difficult to find empirical evidence for the misogynic aspects of Islamism, and I speak now of Islamism, not generally of Islam. In many Islamic countries, strict gender segregation exists. Women are banned from the public life. The covering of heads and bodies is enforced either by society or by the state. We find forced marriages, polygamy, child marriages, and other violations of women's rights that should actually be condemned by the United Nations if the convention, this convention of the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, which has been adopted in 1979 by the UN, would have been taken seriously. In fact, this is not the case. Even the most bizarre forms of violence against women did not trigger interventions by the international community in the past. And the West also often remained indifferent, contrary to its own agenda. And I give you 4 examples for this. The first one is a case of the Nigerian Amina Lawal, who became pregnant after her divorce and was subsequently sentenced to stoning by a Sharia court in 2002. The alleged crime was zina, a moral offense against God, because Amina was suspected of illicit sexual intercourse. That means sex outside of the marriage. After international protests, the execution was initially suspended, but then an argument was presented that was obviously compliant with the local Islamic convictions. Her lawyers claimed that Amina's pregnancy was a so-called sleeping pregnancy, in which the embryo remained in the mother's womb for years before it starts to grow. The father of the child in Amina's case was therefore considered to be the divorced husband, and she was no longer considered to be guilty. The second example also comes from Nigeria. In 2014, the Islamist militia Boko Haram kidnapped 276 Christian schoolgirls in northern Nigeria, forced them to convert to Islam, and married them off to jihadists. Dozens of these abductees are still in the hands of the kidnappers. Both incidents were the result of a rise of Islamism, which, however, never became a topic of UN debates or even resulted in sanctions. In Nigeria itself, the state is taking action only against some sorts of Islamic terrorism, but not against everyday Islamism. On the contrary, in 1924, Nigeria supported the resolution called Measures to Combat Islamophobia, introduced by Pakistan. The third example concerns Yazidi women and girls who had been enslaved, sold, raped, and murdered by ISIS. One of the women is Nadia Murad, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018. In 2021, in Canada, an event with her was cancelled by the Toronto District School Board because they feared it might allegedly strengthen Islamophobia. The last and most recent example is a massive sexualized violence against Israeli women during the attack by Hamas and Islamic Jihad on October 7, 2023. The organization UN Women took 8 weeks to issue a statement. The American feminist Judith Butler publicly doubted that rapes had taken place, and the Toronto Film Festival just cancelled a documentary because it might violate Hamas film rights. Those who protest against the silence and glorification of rape, like that German activist Caroline Preisler, are facing death threats. When violence against women and girls is carried out in the name of Islam, politicians, Islamic leaders, and left-wing activists usually claim that this has nothing to do with Islam, or is even un-Islamic. However, anyone who looks at the Quran and the Islamic traditions must acknowledge that this does not correspond to reality. A whole series of Quranic verses justify the discrimination of women and even legitimize violence. For example, the Surah 4:34. It says, "Men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has given the one more than the other and because they support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous woman is devoutly obedient." And to those women on those part you feel disloyalty, and here Allah speaks to the men, admonish them, refuse to share their bed, and beat them until they return to obedience. Other surahs justify polygamy, stipulate that women may not leave the house until absolutely necessary, explain that their testimony in courts count only half as much as that of a man, or that a husband, can have sex with his wife as he pleases. Since Muhammad is seen as the ultimate role model for every Muslim, the marriage of girls before puberty is also permissible according to many Islamic scholars, because the Prophet himself is said to have married Aisha when she was a child. In this respect, the specific disenfranchisement of women that we find in the Islamic world today naturally has something to do with Islam and is justified by Islamic normativity. However, I would like to emphasize that notions of a deeply patriarchal order were also normatively anchored in other religions and also in Christianity. All religions emerged in times when patriarchal structures prevailed, and they reflect the norms of those times. Individual rights as we know them are the product of the European Enlightenment of the 18th and 19th century. Due to lively travel activities among the upper classes in these times, the ideas of enlightenment were also discussed in Islamic regions of the world. Strictly speaking, by the end of the 19th century at the latest, we find the same debates regarding women's rights to education and employment, to a self-determined life, and demands to reform of patriarchal family law in both the Orient and the Occident. In the West, pioneers of this intellectual awakening include women such as Olympe de Gouges, on the left hand, who wrote a manifesto for women during the French Revolution, and Louise Otto, on the right side, who founded the first women's association in Germany. In the East, it was Raden Arjun-Kartini who opened the first girls' schools in Indonesia, and Huda Sharabi, who removed her veil during a public speech in Egypt. Men like John Stuart Mill in England and Tahar Haddad in Tunisia also took up the cause of women. Many intellectuals in the past believed that modernity should be secular, and they influenced politics. In the Turkish Republic, the first president, Atatürk, enshrined secularism in the constitution, disempowered the Muslim orders, and abolished the caliphate. In 1925, the veil was banned. In 1926, polygamy was ended. In 1935, women were granted the right to vote and to stand for election. In Iran, the Islamic headscarf was banned in 1936, and in many Islamic countries, at least in the larger cities, a phase of cultural liberalization began, even in Afghanistan, where King Amanullah Khan tried to implement modern values. And this is Afghanistan. In response, Islamists organized a revitalization movement, condemned the freedom of women as an attack on Islam, and demanded a return to the Quran and the principles of early Islam. The Islamist movement was not very successful until the end of the 1970s, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini took over the power. Equally important was the launch of a Saudi government program to export Wahhabi Islam around the world using petrodollars. And Wahhabi Islam is well known for its misogyny. In the West, it is often claimed that men alone seek to impose Islamism and that women are in naturally opposition to this. This is the basis for a ruling of the European Court of Justice from October 2024 that all Afghan women should be granted asylum in Europe. This decision is fatal because women are often just as fanatical Islamist as men. In Iran in 1979, female Islamists were the most ardent advocates of the Islamic Revolution, wrapped in the black chador, as you see. In Indonesia, they demonstrated for an anti-pornography law that generally suspected women's clothing of being pornographic and attempted to enforce compulsory veiling. In Indonesia, after the Arab Spring, they called for an Islamic state with Sharia as its sole law. Female Islamists even hired themselves out as Islamist assassins or joined the Islamic State. And here we find that romance propaganda of ISIS in 2014. On the other hand, it also must be mentioned that women's rights activists in all these countries fight fearlessly for full gender equality, even under dangerous conditions. These are not contradictions, but two sides of the coin. The Islamic world is caught in an ongoing culture war since the beginning of the 20th century, which with one segment of the population demanding universal civil liberties and another segment seeking a normative return to the 7th century. Unfortunately, backward-looking segment is currently the most successful, even in the West. And I would like to show how Islamism is gaining ground by examining the debate surrounding the Islamic headscarf, which has become the strongest symbol of Islamism. Although I do not want to claim that every woman wearing a headscarf is an Islamist. My example is Indonesia, once known as a land of the smiling Islam. It began with the end of the 32-year rule of the secular dictator Suharto, who, under pressure from a growing democracy movement, sought to halt his loss of power by playing the Islamic card. To portray himself as a devout Muslim, he banned gambling, opened an Islamic bank, and allowed schoolgirls to wear the headscarf. Saudi-influenced Islamists had already argued that the headscarf ban, which was until that time in Indonesia, suppressed the freedom of pious Muslim girls, and Suharto could build on this emancipatory discourse. However, immediately after the veiling of schoolgirls was allowed, the discourse changed. Wearing the headscarf was declared a divinely imposed duty for all girls and women. Anyone who violated this rule was ostracized as un-Islamic. Headscarves and an Islamic lifestyle were promoted in films, novels, and sermons. An Islamic fashion industry emerged. At the same time, the first attacks on unveiled women occurred. Women and girls began to veil themselves for fear of social exclusion and open violence. Today, headscarves are mandatory for women and girls in many regions of Indonesia. Of course, the veil didn't come alone, but rather as part of a complete package with a Sharia-based legal system, which also includes, these are the girls with the Islamic clothing. It comes with a Sharia-based legal order, which also includes public flogging. And this is a picture taken in the province of Aceh in 2005. This pattern of a step-by-step Islamization using an emancipatory discourse can also be found in the West. In Europe, Canada, and the United States, the veil is also promoted with feminist arguments. It's about agency, self-determination, or even freedom. However, a closer look reveals, we have this also for the burqa, for the niqab, a closer look reveals, as this social media post demonstrates, that in the Islamist context, neither freedom nor emancipation is at stake. Rather, it's about a corset of norms that is considered divinely ordained. Failure to comply threatens the fires of hell, or worse, repression from family, neighbors, and the state. Many Western feminists refuse to address the disenfranchised situation of Muslim women. Their worldview is shaped by so-called post-colonial theory, which divides the world in two antagonistic poles. On the one hand, there is the white West, accused of being intrinsically racist, still adhering to a colonial mindset and being responsible for all the world's ills. On the other hand, there are groups of people who are declared victims of the West based on external characteristics. Muslims are on top of the victim pyramid. Criticism of their misogynistic structures is forbidden for those who do not want to expose themselves to the suspicion of anti-Muslim racism. Even the mention of concrete cases of oppression of Muslim women can be branded as a racist narrative. The delegitimization of criticism corresponds to the folklorization of Islamism. Since the end of the 20th century, Western scholars have competed with each other in hymns of praise for the veiled Muslim woman who, through her veiling, evades Western sexualization and lives her own supposedly freely chosen form of piety. In my own discipline, anthropology, the term piety is used instead of the term Islamism because it evokes association of deep spirituality. Numerous publications have appeared celebrating Islamist women as role models of a specific, namely Muslim emancipation. Concerns about the Muslim headscarf and even the burqa were unceremoniously scandalized as Islamophobic, and an entire genre of Islamophile publications emerged in the field of gender and cultural studies. This approach guarantees a fast career at the universities. To those who research honor-based violence, forced marriage, or religiously legitimized violence against Muslim women, those scholars are put under pressure and usually had to end their academic careers. Islamism, however, doesn't only affect Muslim women in the West. For years, statistics have shown an increase of sexual violence in public spaces, which has now led to women's withdrawing. Since the mass sexual assaults on New Year's Eve in 2015-16, many women in Germany no longer celebrate the New Year in the streets or in public squares. They avoid pedestrian zones after dark, no longer use public transport, and are increasingly staying at home. The perpetrators are disproportionately often Muslim men who are third-generation residents in Germany but have never felt emotionally settled, or refugees who are welcomed and supported as asylum seekers. These are men who believe that there are honorable and dishonorable women. Honorable women can be identified with the fact that they wear the veil and do not leave the house unless absolutely necessary, while dishonorable women wear their hairs loose and go to the cinema, the theater, to clubs, and have parties. These men believe they can abuse, rape, and even murder women with impunity. It is just a woman, said the Afghan-born murderer of a Freiburg student in his trial, as if he didn't understand the commotion surrounding his crime. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the American citizen coming from Somalia originally, described the Western women in a recent book as a prey to be hunted by Islamist men. The same feminists who glorify the headscarf as a symbol of Muslim emancipation are also those who remain silent about mass sexual abuse and denounce those who point out this scandal as anti-Muslim racism or even right-wing extremism. We are currently witnessing women's rights fought for over centuries being abandoned by post-colonial feminists themselves, because the perpetrators are Muslims and therefore perceived only as victims. Given the still unresolved migration crisis, the uncontrolled influx of immigrants, primarily from predominantly Muslim countries, the situation will not improve in the future. What we have observed in many formerly moderate Islamic countries is now also true in Western societies. Women are being violently pushed out of the public spaces and deprived of their right to live a safe life on an equal footing with men. If we want to preserve the achievement of the Enlightenment and the rights that women have fought for, Islamism must stop now in the Islamic world and in the West. Thank you.